आप सबको पता है कि नेपाल और इंडिया के बीच में एक बड़ा डिस्प्यूट चल रहा है, वो है कालापानी लिपुलेख के बारे में। बेसिकली एक इंडियन सर है जो कालापानी लिपुलेख और लिम्पियाधुरा के बारे में इंडियन लोगों को बताया जा रहा है कि नेपाल के साथ ये ज्यादती हो रही है कि इनसे ये जगह ले ली गई है और इन जगहों के ऊपर डिस्प्यूट चल रहा है। वीडियो को देखते हुए आपके साथ शेयर करते कि भाई इसके बारे में, जैसे कि कालापानी लिपुलेख और लिम्पियाधुरा के बारे में इंडियन लोग क्या कह रहे हैं, क्योंकि ये डिस्प्यूट नेपाल के साथ भी इंडिया का है, पाकिस्तान के साथ भी है और मुख्तलिफ ममालिकों के साथ जिन जिनका बॉर्डर लगता है उनके साथ चल रहा है, चाइना के साथ भी है। तो सबसे पहले हम इंडियन बॉर्डर का देखते हैं कि नेपाल के साथ जो उनका डिस्प्यूट चल रहा है या नेपाली जगहों के ऊपर कब्जा किया हुआ है। चलिए सबसे पहले व्लॉग देख के फिर आपके साथ बात करते हैं।
During the Madheshi blockade, right? The role played by these states in trying to de-escalate the crisis, right? So there is significance of para or constituent diplomacy. And students, right? Nepal being a small neighbor, right? Yeah, though it is not our protectorate state like we say Bhutan, but India's defense and security relationship with Nepal becomes significant. For example, India training the Nepalese army, building their capacities and capabilities, right? And then Gorkhas, right? Now serving the Indian army, which are their contribution is very significant in protecting India's borders with China. The several events which you've seen, and economy, right? Not very significant, right? We have got a trade about $1.5 billion. Then of course that's a legal route, and there's a lot of illegal trade also happening between India and Nepal. So there are certain issues regarding that, right? So India is Nepal's largest trading partner, obviously, right? It is our strategic backyard, and Nepal is India's 11th largest trading partner, right? So there is also scope for improvement in trade, and India has a trade surplus with Nepal, which often has worked against India's favor, right? So in this context, I'll explain the broader aspect of what is called India's neighborhood diplomacy, right? And yes, India's neighborhood diplomacy, neighborhood first policy, Nepal being part of it, and Nepal being part of India's proximate neighborhood, right? Now, if you look at the complex nature of South Asian diplomacy or neighborhood diplomacy, students, right? We are the largest nation, one of the largest economies in the world, in fact, the 5th largest. The top 4th space power, the top 4th defense power, a nation with huge demographic resources, right? And we have got another 7 smaller neighboring nations with a porous neighborhood, right? And which are from the, let's say, the low-income group nations or the least developed countries. India being, a developing nation, an emerging market economy, right? A middle-income group nation, right? So naturally, these countries, right? Would have a perception that India is trying to behave like a big brother rather than an elder brother. And nations such as China, which is India's strategic rival in the region, right? Like I'm fighting for regional supremacy and global supremacy now, right? Wherein they have an indoctrinated ideology into the Nepalese political establishment, and also the Nepalese people that India is behaving like a big brother, right? It is intervening in their sovereignty, and it is not respecting the other nation's territorial integrity. But this is, is all negative perception. In essence, India has never been an expansionist power, right? So we'll have to be very careful, right? That is where, right, explaining, building narratives to the people, counter narratives to the people of Nepal, right? People-to-people contacts, cultural ties, media associations, right? The diplomatic maturity of India in explaining to these countries about the nefarious designs of China are all very significant. So this is the broader context, students, right? So in foreign policy, especially as far as neighborhood, foreign policy diplomacy is concerned, keeping in the backdrop of India's, let's say, India's what you call as India's dominance, or let's say India's huge presence in the South Asian neighborhood, right? It becomes very important to build a positive perception and a positive image. Image building or optics is very significant here. And I've told you, right, some of the irritants, right, the brighter side and the darker side, right, one of the irritants is the border dispute, right, the Lipulekh and Sasta escalating in 2020 due to road inauguration, right? So this is the reason. Kalapani, we had a jail also. Lipulekh, this is your access to China. And this is Kalapani, right? And Lipulekh, right? And all this becomes, this is, right, Uttarakhand, yeah. And this becomes significant since students, right? China being India's neighbor, right? Yeah, wants to increase its strategic presence in the region, right? So it has built two constructs. One is your the Belt and Road Initiative, which Nepal wants to become part of it, and then the string of pearls theory, wherein it wants to strategically encircle India in the region by building their bases and their presence in these countries, right? And China has also embarked upon the strategy of building political leadership in these countries, right, who are not, let's say, sensitive to India's strategic concerns, inimical to India's concerns, and working against India's interests, favoring China, right? Like we've seen in Nepal, the political establishment, right? The Nepalese Congress, the CPN-UML, right? Yeah, the CPI, CPN Maoist, right? Different wavering political stands as far as building relations with India is concerned, right? Yeah. Then, yeah, this kind of Chinese intervention, and then building narratives about India, that India is trying to behave like a big brother, right? And the China-Nepal economic corridor and the famous rail line, right, from, let's say, yeah, Kathmandu to Tibet, right, which is China's autonomous region, right? And China's increasing presence in Nepal, which I've told you, right, students, right? Yeah. And yes, another important development is, right, like what has happened in Sri Lanka, Nepal being pushed into the Chinese strategic fold of debt diplomacy, right? That is China extending hard loans to these countries and eventually, right, swallowing their economies, where these countries are unable to repay the huge loans which they were taken, right? The famous Hambanto type sort of Sri Lanka. Then you know the Sri Lankan crisis, right? So we'll have to be very careful, right? With cautious optimism, with trust and verification, we need to look at this issue where China is trying to slowly push Nepal into its debt trap. Yes, students. So we have seen the brighter aspects of India-Nepal relationship and also the darker aspects, right? Darker aspects is the areas of improvement, which are irritants, right? But being India's, we are joined by geography, right? Like what our former Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee usually used to say, right? You can't change your neighbors, right? Right? So you can't change your neighbors, you can't change your geographical alignment. So we'll have to live with this reality that this country called Nepal exists, and wherein we need to handle relations with them with a velvet glove, right? At the same time, we need to display cautious optimism, trust but verify, right? And try to bridge the trust deficit and always have an eye over the Chinese strategic involvement in Nepal. Yes, students, right? Okay. Then if you look at the prelims question, students, right? I've told you, where Kali River is often seen in media related, which of the following, right? Yes, obviously the answer is C for China. I'm sorry, that is C for China means, right? Option C, Nepal, right? I've told you the Mahakali Treaty, the Pancheshwar Treaty, the transboundary rivers, right? Over which, let's say, projects have been built and project agreements have been made. Yeah. So this is your part of your energy diplomacy or resource diplomacy and the overall economic diplomacy between India and Nepal, right? The Mahakali Treaty, the Pancheshwar Treaty, right? So the transbound river is Mahakali or the Kali River, right? Then of course you also have other rivers such as your Kosi River, right? Which is now called Bihar's Sorrow. Then students, right? The mains practice questions, right? As far as mains question is concerned, students, it features as part of your paper 2. And in the last 5 years, we've seen questions on Indo-Nepal relations being surfaced, right? So it is important to understand the multiple dimensions which we did as far as India-Nepal relations is concerned, and then practicing the answers. So the question goes like this, students, right? Give an account of the historical evolution of India-Nepal relationship. Discuss the strategic importance of Nepal to India in the view of increasing Chinese influence in the region, right? Now let's say a question for about 200 to 250 words is what can be explained in this context, right? Yeah. Now I've told you, any question in international relations, we have a 3-step approach. Step number 1, read the question twice, right? This should take you another 15 to 20 seconds. Let's say you get 250 words answer, you're given a space of 10 minutes. Okay. Right? So give an account of the historical evolution of India-Nepal relationship. Discuss the strategic importance of Nepal to India in the view of increasing Chinese influence in the region. Right? So this is step number 2, locus and focus. What is the context? Context locus is the historical evolution and the strategic historical evolution of India-Nepal relationship, the broad aspect, and then the focus is strategic importance of Nepal in the wake of the increasing Chinese presence in the region. Right? Yes, students. Yeah. Okay, now look at this. Right now, how do we answer? Step number 3 is introduction, body conclusion.
तो आप लोगों ने वीडियो देख लिया, आप लोगों को पता चल चुका होगा बेसिकली ये एक सर थे जो अपने स्टूडेंट्स को पढ़ा रहे थे पेपर्स के बारे में कि पेपर्स में आपसे ये सवाल हो सकते हैं कि जैसे कि बेसिकली जो बॉर्डर इंडिया का डिस्प्यूट चल रहा है, नेपाल के साथ चल रहा है, चाइना के साथ चल रहा है, पाकिस्तान के साथ चल रहा है। अब पाकिस्तान का जो इनके साथ चल रहा है वो तो बड़ा जबरदस्त जगह है, वो तो कश्मीर है। चाइना के साथ इनका दूसरी जगह है, नेपाल का बड़ा जबरदस्त जगह है जो आपको पता है, कालापानी, लिपुलेख, लिम्पियाधुरा। ये पहली दफा नहीं है कि इसके ऊपर बात हो रही है। 2019, 2020 और इसके अलावा मुख्तलिफ बारों और मुख्तलिफ जगहों के अंदर इसके बारे में बात हुई है और लोग इसके बारे में बात करना चाह रहे हैं, पसंद करना चाह रहे हैं इसके बारे में। देखिए बेसिकली नेपाल के जो कालापानी, लिपुलेख, लिम्पियाधुरा ये इंटरनेशनली अगर हम इसको देखते हैं तो इसको बड़ा इशू किया गया कि भाई इंटरनेशनली इसके बारे में चीजें हैं। हमें ये नहीं देखना चाहिए कि यार इसके ऊपर से पाकिस्तान की मीडिया बात करे तो इशू होगा या इंटरनेशनल मीडिया, ये अभी से नहीं, बहुत टाइम से इसके ऊपर इशू चल रहा है और अभी पढ़ाया जा रहा है कि भाई ये ग्रेटर ये जो है वो ये जो है खास करके ये जो है वो नेपाल का हमारे साथ डिस्प्यूट चल रहा है जिसमें कालापानी है, लिपुलेख और लिम्पियाधुरा, ये अभी स्टूडेंट्स को पढ़ाया जा रहा है ताकि उनको पता चले। आम आवाम को तो पता है और जिनको नहीं पता तो उनको ये समझाने की कोशिश करें एज ए यूट्यूब वीडियो के, ताकि आपसे अगर पेपर में सवाल आ जाए तो आपको पता होना चाहिए कि भाई इंडिया का बॉर्डर का डिस्प्यूट किसके साथ चल रहा है, इंडिया का पाकिस्तान के साथ चल रहा है, नेपाल के साथ चल रहा है या चाइना के साथ चल रहा है। अब नेपाल के साथ जो है वो कौन कौन सी जगह है आपको पता है, कालापानी, लिपुलेख, लिम्पियाधुरा। इंडिया का पाकिस्तान के साथ कश्मीर और चाइना के साथ अभी मुझे सही तरीके से याद दिया। वीडियो अगर इंटरेस्टिंग लगी है तो वीडियो को लाइक लाजमी करें। मिलता है नेक्स्ट वीडियो में।